Good afternoon. Thanks again for allowing me to be here and for allowing me to speak. And I'll just get started right away. To start off, I want to introduce you to someone, or something rather. This is Matilda, our church van. And I am the one who's probably the most responsible for naming the church van Matilda. I'm also responsible for taking this picture in the wintertime, just to remind all of us where we live, that we do live in Minnesota. And on Thursday, November 10th, last year, 2016, I was inside of this van driving through St. Paul. St. Paul is where a number of the families that attend our church live. These families also happen to be Karen refugees. And on that day, I was very happy. I had the van full of all of these kids. My kids were in there because they were friends with these kids. And the reason why we were using the church van wasn't so much because the family was large, but more so because their family was about to get larger. The mother of this family, her sister, so the auntie of the kids, her sister, their father, and their kids were finally arriving in Minnesota from a refugee camp in Thailand. This family had been separated for years, and they were super excited to get back together again. I was excited too, and I was also really excited that for once I was on time. And you'll find out in a bit why that's important. But as I was driving to St. Paul, I was stopped at a red light right in front of the on-ramp to 35 East South. And I noticed as I was stopped there that this group of individuals started crossing the street in front of me. I normally wouldn't think anything of that, but one of them was holding up a sign. And then after they crossed the street, a larger group of maybe 10 or 12 individuals crossed after them, and one of them was also holding a sign, and I thought, that's weird. So I leaned forward and looked down the street, and lo and behold, there's an even larger crowd of maybe 50 to 75 people, all holding signs that I could now read that had a lot of colorful wording on them, some profanities and stuff, and my immediate thought was, kids, lock the door, you know? And my other immediate thought was, I think I'm gonna be late again for something. And the reason why I remember the date is because 2 days prior was Tuesday, November 8th, 2016. And after all the ballots had been counted and all the concession speeches had been made, we had elected a new president, Donald Trump, to be the president of the United States. And all these people had come out to show their opinions on how they felt about the election. And I was immediately, at that moment, kind of beset by the irony of my life. Because there I was, stopped at a red light, on my way to the airport to pick up a newly arrived refugee family, being held up by a guy holding a sign that says, "We welcome refugees and Latinos in the Twin Cities." And I wanted to share that story and start with that because we do live in a time that seems to be very polarized on the subject of how to address the refugee crisis in the world. And I don't use that word lightly. It is certainly a crisis. And this polarization isn't just contained to people and groups and organizations outside of the church. But what struck me was how much it does also appear to be inside of the church as well. So I was curious when I initially started writing this paper if it was possible, whether it would be difficult or easy, to lay out kind of a theological framework for the biblical mandate to help refugees, help people who are oppressed, who are persecuted, to help sojourners who are traveling to a foreign land. So this would have to include, this theological framework that I knew I'd have to write through and think about, would have to include certainly how we are to deal with people who are not like us, the sojourner, the foreigner. It would also have to deal with people who are in need or oppressed, because a refugee is by definition both. It's someone who is forcibly displaced from their homeland, traveling somewhere else because of some form of persecution. But a lot of the nuance that I knew I'd have to explore was also how Christians and how churches, how organizations are to deal with and enter into and reach out to refugee communities. And also at times how individual believers and churches and groups would address different levels of public policy on a local, state, or even national level. And the question you might be asking is, what does this have to do with me? I don't go to your church, I don't drive Matilda or anything like that. Well, this is why it's important, first and foremost. In 2015, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, I totally forgot to show you the pictures of the protesters, but if you want to see them after, let me know. According to a 2015 report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there are 65.3 million displaced people, forcibly displaced people worldwide. That's the largest number of people since World War II. And 65.3 million is kind of a hard number to conceptualize. It's hard to visualize that many people. So to put it in context, if all of those folks had turned into just one nation unto themselves, they would be the 26th largest nation in the world. Of those 65.3, 21.3 million are registered as refugees. And of that 21.3 million, 10 million of those folks are stateless, meaning that they can neither identify with nor are they represented by any existing governmental authority. And of that 65.3 million people, at least half are children, are people under the age of 18. And as staggering as those figures are, and they are pretty staggering figures, in 2015, 107,100 refugees were officially resettled into a new home, the rest remaining in refugee camps or just traveling from place to place. In Minnesota, since 1979, Minnesota has received 90,000 refugees, more than 90,000 refugees since 1979. The largest groups historically being, as many of you probably know, Hmong, Somali, Vietnamese, Ethiopians, Liberians, Cambodians, Bosnians, folks from the former Soviet Union. The most recent refugee groups to arrive, ones that our church are working with, are Karen people and other refugees from Burma. Other folks that have arrived are Iraqis, Nepali-speaking refugees from Bhutan. So that's why it's important, because there is a great need. Another reason why it's important, which I found through the writing of this paper for class, is that it does seem pretty clear that there is a biblical mandate to help both the sojourner and the oppressed and the downtrodden. Millard Erickson, when we're talking about theology, it's probably pretty good to quote him. Millard Erickson states that concern for the fatherless, the widow, and the sojourner is appropriate for those who worship a God who himself displays such concern. And in the Old Testament, we see many, many examples of how we are to treat and care for the sojourner. In Exodus, we read that you shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. In 1 Kings 8, King Solomon prays to God that God would hear the requests of foreign peoples in their land so that his name would be made great among all the nations, among all the peoples. And of course, a popular verse among many of us, Jesus speaks in Matthew 25, for I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So there does appear to be a biblical mandate to help the sojourner. And what of the needy? Well, the church is to show concern and take action wherever it sees need or hurt. Just a couple of examples in the book of James: religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. We see the same thing in James chapter 2, that if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, but doesn't do anything about it, well, we're not to do that. And probably the most scathing indictment against those who refuse to care for the needy can be found in Ezekiel 16:49. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. And you all remember what happened to Sodom. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor or needy. So it's not just myself, but other theologians as well that have very clearly come to the conclusion that there is a biblical mandate to help the sojourner, to help the oppressed and the needy. Erickson, just to summarize his quote here, also states that evangelicals per capita do better than mainline churches and even the general populace in leading the charge and helping people in this way. But when I read that, there was something about it that struck me. Because whether or not that's true, it still struck me and had me kind of step back, because as you know, in early March, there was another event that occurred which caused a lot of people to go out and hold signs. In early March, President Trump did sign into effect an executive order that barred people from 7 majority Muslim countries to enter the United States, that also halted refugee resettlement for 120 days. So refugees from anywhere. And immediately many different news articles started reporting the evangelical church's reaction to this. And you'll see news articles like this one: why evangelicals are Trump's strongest travel ban supporters. On the other side, you'll see Minnesota faith leaders condemn Trump's executive order on refugees. And also, is there only one Christian response to the Syrian refugee crisis? I mean, is there? Is there, if it can be pretty clearly set forth that the Bible teaches us to act and live in this particular way? And there was this quote also by Franklin Graham that we cannot allow Muslim immigrants to come across our borders unchecked while we are fighting this war on terror. So I don't think that's my music. It would be kind of weirdly appropriate, but not really appropriate. But anyways, so I had to ask myself the question, why this tension within evangelicalism for whether or not we should help refugees or allow them into the country? And my first thought was it some sort of desire to maintain that separation between church and state? And clearly there are many scriptural things we can look to that show that the church should remain in its own sphere of influence and the state should remain in its own sphere of influence. But I had to step back and say, no, that couldn't be it, because these leaders were coming forward, kind of throwing their hat in the ring on either side. So it wasn't them trying to recuse themselves from proclaiming their opinion on public policy. And what I found, kind of anecdotally in my own church and the ministry that we lead, and what I was starting to see kind of jumping at me through the scriptures, I'll explain in an illustration just to save the time. As you heard in the overview, I work in a multicultural church. I pastor the Filipino American Christian Church, myself being Filipino American. And here's something that I've observed anecdotally. When you have a Filipino immigrant coming to America, when that immigrant starts to notice differences between the Filipino church and the American church, the natural tendency is to view those differences as things that are as deficiencies in the American church. And vice versa is true. When you have an American going to the Philippines, whether it's for visiting relatives or for a missions trip, they'll observe differences between the American church and the Filipino church as deficiencies in the Filipino church. And here's what I think is happening, is that at times, what can happen is that we'll start to, we have a tendency to think that the things we identify, the things that we use to identify us as being part of a particular culture or community, that those are the very same things that identify us as being part of the covenant community of God. We start to assume that the way we look with the rest of our folks in church is actually, in fact, what makes us Christian as opposed to other things. I know I am running short on time, so I'll just close with another illustration about time, speaking of time. When you go to our church's website, for example, it says that our service begins at 11:30 every Sunday. And when I run into folks from a Western culture background and they ask me, hey, when's your service? I'd love to come visit. I say it starts at 11:30. But when I visit Filipinos, or when I go to a Filipino event and they say, hey, Pastor, I'd really love to come to your church. I hear you have food after. I miss Filipino food. When's your service? What time do you suppose I tell them? I say 11:15, maybe 11 o'clock. And the reason for that is because in our culture, it's perfectly acceptable to show up to things late. There's nothing wrong with that. But in Western cultures, you've got to be on time. And now the question is, which one of those modes and practices of worship is more holy or righteous than the other? If we asked the Filipino, he'd say, well, being late, certainly, because it shows we're not bound to worshiping God during a specific time on the weekends. But if you ask someone from a Western background, we would probably say, well, being on time, being intentional and giving your best to the Lord. I would posit, and I'll just leave you with this little quote from David Wells. You can ponder that, and I'll just give you my conclusion here. I would propose that there is a biblical mandate to love and assist refugees, to love and assist those who are oppressed and downtrodden. I, however, at the end of all of this, I found myself at a loss for how to address the inadequacies in modern evangelicalism to push believers beyond an egocentric and ethnocentric priority when attempting to identify oneself and others as being part of the covenant community of God. To push people beyond that and into having a Christ-focused or Christ-centered priority when attempting to identify oneself and others as being part of the covenant community of God. I feel like if we can solve that, it would help to solve all those other tensions we see when multicultural issues come up. Are there any questions?